So there's a whole set. But that's the reason, you know, the blue is covered here, the red is covered here, so the most reflected part is the green. So just to answer this question. So.
You showed a map of the world with the spots that you need to cover in solar cells to get enough energy. And just at the moment, how big, like, that's currently working, is there a solar cell farm or whatever somewhere? Like, how close are we to that sort of being able to do anything like that?
Well, we are very far away from that. I don't know. Actually, Don, would you know how much square meters of solar cells have been installed worldwide? We are far. The only thing I can say to you is we are far away from that. Far away. Most of the countries have a negligible harvesting. I think Germany and Japan, because they have a government program, are leading, but this is also just a fraction of a percent, maybe 1.5% of the total power consumption of these countries. Worldwide, it doesn't play any role yet. But it's interesting to show that there is enough solar power to, you know, fulfill all the needs. You know, there's still a problem. How can you store it? Now, if you have solar power, what are we doing at night? We need to store it. Or we need wind at night. There's enough wind in Ireland. I mean, I think realistically we need a mix at some stage. Why not using some tidal power and some wave power in connection, even with nuclear power? The point with the nuclear is that you can make reactors, for example, nowadays much better than the current reactors which we have to live with. There's one important thing. We still haven't solved the problem. What are we going to do with the nuclear waste? And it's a very critical thing, and I hate governments which just go ahead and say, oh, we make 20 new power plants, and well, just by law we store them somewhere until we have a solution. I think the minimum is that you have a solution before you start that, and not just creating nuclear waste and saying, actually, we have no idea what we do. You know, the cellar field doesn't work too nice. I've spoken to some environmentalists from UCD. Actually, you can measure that. You can, if you have your probe, you just let it plunge into the Irish Sea. You can measure a cellar field straight away. It's a very strong background signal. I think something is wrong there. If you can measure that, how far are we away from that? Who would know that? 100 miles? Something like this. If you can measure that in the sea 100 miles away, think about the dilution factor. There is something wrong with that. I'm sorry to say that. I'm not against nuclear power, but I think the way nuclear power is handled in order to harvest as much money from such things, I mean, this seems to be wrong to me, without having further details on that. But there's also that leukemia rate surrounding such sites, which is shockingly high. Even the people say that's just accidental like this. I don't believe in that. But nuclear power is the only existing power which is readily developed not to create combustion gases. So this is no CO2 is coming from that processes. So it might help until we have a kind of final master solution. Hey. Okay, see new victims. So.
The material that you use to make the cells, is there a limit on those? Are they natural resources or are they in abundance?
Well, titanium dioxide, well, the problem is we have enough silicon on Earth, theoretically. I just learned that it's very expensive to harvest that. So actually a company came to us and said, okay, now we have huge, you know, there's actually a mine and it produces silicon dioxide, sand, billions of tons. It's not usable because if there are certain things in the sand, they're very difficult to get them out. And for making solar cells, like for the chip industry, you need highest purity silicon in the end. And that's a very, very expensive process. Now think about, you know, Intel, for example, is using the same raw materials, but Intel is able to sell something like a square centimeter silicon wafer for something like at least 200 euros. If the solar cells on a square meter would then cost 100,000 euros, that's not going to work there. So the solar cell industry is there at a disadvantage because you need a decent area, and that's a problem here. Well, coming back to your question, which I didn't answer yet, yeah, titanium dioxide is there plenty. You know, it's really in toothpaste, in paint, everywhere, and you still need a special purity here, but it's not as critical as with the silicon, surprisingly. And there's no industry which needs high purity titanium dioxide, as far as I'm not aware of that. So there's no competing industry yet in high purity titanium dioxide. Otherwise, it's used everywhere. And even in the room, I guess all the white you see, there's some titanium dioxide in there, potentially at least. And yeah, the dye. We can use dyes which are, well, you have more dyes than you need. The dyes which are used here, the ruthenium dyes, are relatively expensive. Even they are a byproduct from, ironically, from the oil production process. So refineries produce the ruthenium complex, part of that. It needs to be synthesized, but the ruthenium at least comes from bioprocesses there, which I think is ironic and interesting. So the people, well, Michael Graetzel will tell you that he just needs so little that the price of the dye doesn't play a role. There's something we can't answer yet, and this is how expensive would such a cell be on the large-scale industrial process. I can't honestly answer you. I know it's much cheaper than a classical solar cell, but what we're doing at the moment is a lab scale. On the lab scale, you buy just the best materials you can get, and you don't care about how expensive they are, because then it really doesn't play a role. I don't know what would happen if you go for a single dye and you would use it worldwide. So you probably would create a problem there. So you would need a range of different dyes maybe to cover that. And stability is an issue. You need better dyes than the ones we have anyway. So I remember there was another victim here.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you for calling me a victim. Your research is very much mimicking photosynthesis, and I'm just wondering, I've read recently about a system where, particularly in Germany, that 2 layers of paint painted on the roof of the car, the bonnet, and on the boot can produce a photovoltaic cell, and also using the battery as a means of storing any energy that's being produced from that solar effect. I'm just wondering, your current research, can you see a possible way of inputting or joining into that? Because obviously if we have cars going around that can charge up batteries, that would be a fantastic system, but it seems to be very much at developmental stage.
Yeah, it could have an easy way. I would not say yes, you're right. and I think, okay, with the cars, that's a thing, of course. I mean, this shows actually what we have to do. The cars we are all driving, including me, they are not sustainable. They're much too heavy, and if you go for a solar-driven car, for example, and you see how heavy is it, like a bike or 2 bikes maybe, at most 100 kilograms, and then you can actually power a bike by solar cells. If you do something like a car, what you want to do is, of course, to get the most efficient solar cells. So in this case, you wouldn't go for the cheapest solar cell. I think in the moment, if you go for the highest efficiency, you want to go for something like at least a silicon single crystal phase, in fairness. And this is what you want to do if you send a satellite somewhere. You just want to make it sure you want the most reliable system, and you just want that the satellite is working as long as possible, because you spend billions into the program. If you want to harvest energy on a grand scale, then I think it flips over. Then you want it as cheap as possible. So if you are able to create a dye system with a DSSC cell, which is stable enough to last sufficiently long, and it's 10 times cheaper, you're there. So then you don't care about your half efficiency, because you're 10 or 100 times cheaper, and you can cover the whole roofs. I mean, I wasn't sure about that. If you cover all roofs on Ireland, that would be sufficient, right? So more than sufficient. So even with a half efficient cell covering all the roofs on Ireland, and we just have to solve the problems of energy storage, which, by the way, some of the other projects deal with. The things I didn't talk about is, instead of creating electricity straight away, you can, for example, create hydrogen evolution cells. This is trend 2 actually, and in this case you could produce something you can store. Well, somebody could be critical about that and say hydrogen is not that easy to store, but it's more easy to store than electricity, because it's funny, I learned something, whenever you try to make a talk like this, you look into the internet, see, okay, what resources are there, what nice pictures you can find. And I found actually something that a normal battery, even with lithium, high power, high expensive batteries, are just half as efficient than, for example, if you just store it pneumatically. You compress air, or you pump water, or up a hill, or actually, if you have something heavy, make it spin. and get the energy back later. And this is twice as efficient as a lousy battery. So battery storage is actually not very developed. So, creating electrons might not be the good solution. Maybe we want a mixture. Some of the energy which we want to use is created in terms of electricity, and other solar type cells then create something which is then stored overnight or stored over longer periods. We can store something in the summer which we then harvest in winter. So something like this. Don't say we're anywhere near to a solution there, but that might be a scenario which might work there. Yes.
Hi, Jan. I actually have a question about the storage. You mentioned concentrating solar power before with the mirrors, and they're actually using heat storage. Would it be possible to use that with PV, or perhaps use concentrating solar power with PV? I know that there's some trials into concentrating the solar light on PV and to increase efficiencies and things.
Yeah, the answer again is yes. There are experiments running on concentrator designs together with photovoltaics. It's even that some of the cells need a certain threshold in order to work properly. So if you have a concentrator cell which harvests from a larger area and focus the light down to a smaller area, the threshold is much more easily overcome. So that means these cells could work longer during the day. Even the total light level in a normal construction would fall below the threshold where it practically doesn't harvest anything. So yeah, the answer is yes. And especially there are some there are real big plants where the people try to use huge concentrators to create things, for example, like nonlinear effects, where they really say, okay, now we can drive a complete different process because we have so many photons, which is otherwise not possible for standard solar cells, which are just plain surfaces.
Would you be able to use heat storage? Would you be able to use the heat storage with PV, or would there be some way to combine that?
Well, if you talk about PV, we generate by definition the electrons first. So I don't fully understand the idea behind that now. So heat storage is fine, but okay. The classical way is if you go for heat first, then what the people have done, the power plant I had there somewhere in the desert, this is actually heating up the water and then using the heated water directly in a classical turbine. Well, in a special one, but still in a classical design. Yes, you can do that. But this is not the question. I mean, you have seen the size of such a plant. And this plant is still very far away from being as powerful as a standard classical oil-driven plant or whatever carbon-driven plant in comparison. So you need a lot of these plants. And they're more efficient than a single solar cell, but it's kind of obtrusive and very expensive to make these plants. So if you just cover all the roofs and harvest them because of the big area, it's maybe less efficient, but it's nearly invisible. So it's just on the roofs, and I think it's also very important that energy is not just centrally generated, because that leaves you with the problem of how to distribute it to the different places. So it's very nice if you can generate a certain amount of energy locally, because then the whole distribution grid and all the problems don't come, and all the losses which are connected now by distribution. But I mean, I didn't say you're wrong. Actually, this is one of the many solutions which we should look into, but this is then a different scale. So in order to get enough heat, first you need a huge investment. And this pays back, but it's a different style in principle.
This question is just about people's attitudes towards conservation. Has there been an increase in government funding recently? Has there been a serious change in people's attitudes towards the environment? And has there been reflected in government funding? Maybe, do you know anything about that?
Well, yes, obviously. We got money from SFI. Thanks for that. If there's anybody from SFI, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it has been changed. There had two classical focal points in Ireland. That was bio and information technology. And now we have energy as a third strand, if you like. So yes, that has changed. Still think we have to do more because there's a long time scale. I mean, we have missed some 20, 30 years in developing alternative energy sources. It's a little bit like the engines. I mean, it's not a good comparison maybe, but it's like the engines. Stupid motor has been developed for 100 years now. And most other competing technologies have been just developed for 10 years. So they are at a disadvantage, but that also shows that there might be much more room for improvements there than in the classical technologies. Because I don't think that, I mean, just if you look at the at the cycle, the thermodynamic cycle of an automotor, it doesn't get much better than it is if you don't save, on the mass of the car and so on. Yeah.
You talked about the way nature creates these dyes to generate electricity. What technologies does nature use to store the energy that it creates? Because it must have the same problem as what it needs to store power.
Yeah, so the question about the storage of the energy. And yes, nature is clever because nature is synthesizing the chemicals like the ATP, the adenosine triphosphate, which is an energy source which is used in our muscles, for example, and is driving most of our metabolism. So yes, nature is, as you expect, because it works, it must be much more clever than we are because it is able to generate highly complex chemicals which then serve as an energy storage and actually are very compatible. So it's very important that in us, but also in plants, there are basically the same biological mechanisms in the background, which then allows us to eat the plants and to harvest on them, for example. But well, this is the evolutionary process, of course. But well, yes, to answer your question, yes, nature is more clever. It synthesizes not just the chemicals for energy storage, but also the chemicals which are then used to catalyze these reactions, or enzyme type of things, which actually drive the reactions in the right directions. So nature is thinking ahead and produce the whole portfolio which is needed to use the energy at a later stage. But that is highly complex. So that's not an easy way. I mean, the thing I've showed you before, which is not on this talk now, is still a very strong simplification of what is nature doing. It's highly complex. There are a lot of ultra-fast reactions taking place in the first femtoseconds, and there's a whole chain of not completely known reactions in these light harvesting complexes, which are very interesting, but not easy to mimic at all. I think it's actually beyond our current state of technology to mimic these type of reactions. Yeah.
I just want to know what is more important in dye synthesized solar cell? Is it the life of the cell or the efficiency of the cell?
Okay, I could ask you now, what do you think is more important? I mean, if you are the customer, well, let's assume you want to buy my cells. Probably doesn't happen, but okay, just try your best. You want a cell which lives long enough. So, what does it mean long enough? You're not going onto your roof and exchange your dye on a monthly basis. You want to sell, what would be okay for you? Every 2 years exchange? Every 5 years?
No, I just want to know for the researcher's perspective, like where he should invest his time. He should try to increase the life of the cell or just the efficiency of the cell.
Yeah. Well, if it comes to selling the cell to investors, for example, the efficiency is more important. But my personal belief is that the stability is actually more important because you actually don't care if a 5 or a 6% cell. It doesn't make a big difference to you. But if your cell stops working after a year, you're coming back and saying you want a new one. So I think actually the stability is the more important issue. As long, let's say that the efficiency is on an acceptable scale. You can go to 11%. But you want to exchange, well, I can tell you something about the development so far, that if you go for a dissolved dye in a classical solvent, then they're not as stable. So you go to some called ionic fluids, gel type of things, so semi-solid type of solutions instead of a real solvent, and then the dye cells become much more stable. So this is something Michael Graetzel also looked into, in looking into how can we improve the stability of such cells. And he states they're pretty stable. I actually haven't checked it, so we never checked actually about long-term stability over years, because I mean we are at a research stage where we actually try to synthesize new dyes, completely different from the dyes he's using. And one example is dyes which contain titanium, so titanocenes, which should nicely bind to the titanium nanoparticles. There's quite compatibility in the chemistry. And they attach nicely, and the antennas, which you can synthesize to absorb the light, you can actually design them nearly at will. That's great. So now the problem is, how can you influence the efficiency of the already generated electrons they're conducted along the molecule and are injected into the titanium dioxide. So this is the crucial point. So in most of the cases, if you don't know what you're doing, you create a dye which has a very strong recombination rate. So the electron is never injected into the titanium dioxide, and then the dye does the opposite. So it might be one interesting fact, if you forget about the dye completely, the cell still works. So the titanium dioxide, which is white, means it reflects strongly all over, but still it would be 1% efficiency, roughly. Not too bad, actually. But the dyes can make it 10 times more sensitive if you get the right dye. Okay. If you get the wrong dye, it actually kind of shortcuts the whole reaction, and your sensitivity drops below the 1%, which is, better don't use a dye then. But there are a lot of dyes, hundreds of identified dyes, which are going to 4, 5, 6%, and there are 2 or 3 which go between 8 and 11% now. And there are different stabilities, and you're trying to improve that. One question is, why are they bleaching? And usually bleaching is a process which is driven by oxygen coming into the cell and then making an oxidization somewhere in the dye. So maybe sealing them better or getting some getters inside which take away the oxygen is already an improvement in their stability, if you like. I don't know, but it could be a solution to that. Yeah.
You'd already mentioned about the problem of the huge losses of transporting electricity from one location to another. Do you think that so there's also another area of energy, the importance of energy is research into high temperature superconductors, or at least, liquid nitrogen temperature superconductors. Do you think that would actually be ever a financially viable solution? I mean, with the cost of the saving that you'd make in transporting electricity across large distances, will that ever be counteracted by the cost of actually liquefying all the nitrogen if a liquid nitrogen temperature superconductor was to be found?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I have no idea. It's an interesting aspect. I have no ideas about the financial calculations here. I mean, of course, superconducting would be lossless practically. But you still want to cool something on how many hundred of miles with liquid nitrogen. That's not cheap. So you want to have a real big current there in order to counteract these costs. But this is really beyond my expertise. I have no idea what that cost would involve. Some German, some Japanese, and some French engineers talking about a levitating train, and the train is working. Even nobody's really willing to buy the train, but still, it's a nice showcase. Then you can do something on a ground scale with superconductors. But I really have no idea if this is viable for electricity. I mean, I don't know, but I believe we have several 100 million kilometers of wiring just for the big overland distribution lines, and I don't know if somebody could even pay for that theoretically. So that's all I can say to that. Nobody here an expert in superconducting overland wiring. No. Okay. More questions. Must be more questions.
Anybody anywhere got more questions? One more question, please? Okay. I'll get it over today.
Sorry, just on the practicalities of it. Is the research, is it shared or is it paid for? A lot before research that you would do would be available to China, Africa, India. But we're talking about global warming. Do you think that the government should get together and put money into a fund and just have, not for industry, but for the general population of the world?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. First, you need a solution which is much better than the others. Then you surely want to protect them. Otherwise, there are big companies who just steal your idea and do what they want. Yeah, I mean, if a good solution is found, it should be used for the general public.
Do you think that the solar panels are a good solution at the moment, or do you think they're not advanced enough?
I think they need more research in terms of stability. I think they're a good solution, but okay, I can answer the question in such a way. Solar power is not overly used, even there is plenty of power there potentially. And the reason for that is, well, it's expensive to set it up, and the problem is, what are you going to do with the energy you harvest during the day? it's lost. Most of the day we're all working, so you can't store it yet, not in a meaningful way, and therefore installing solar doesn't grant you what you harvest. In Germany there's a special scheme that the energy companies are forced to accept your current, which you have created, and they have to pay the full rate for that. That's great. So it pays off in Germany, but just because of this subsidizing from the government, because the government forces them by law. I mean, the companies still don't suffer, not at all, and they just say, okay, then our electricity is more expensive. So everybody pays something, in principle, which is given partially back to the people who drive solar power. I think in the present moment, no, it's not a readily developed competing technology, just because if you just look at the payback times and the problems in storing the energy, because most of the time you just harvest the energy when you don't need it. And if you need it at night, then it's not there. And you know, there's no really practical solution.
Is it a better situation for everyone to have their solar panel on their own house rather than kind of the big farm panels, you know?
Yeah.
And just use it, it's like a dynamo on a bicycle rather than batteries.
Yeah.
Kind of
Yeah, this is the part I can answer honestly with yes. I think it's much better. I can't see actually the need for some companies who just get billions from us in generating power in the way we don't want them to generate power. And I think local solutions are much better, and the whole distribution is gone. But you still need the storage. If you want to use it, fine. A lot of people use it, but they still need 90% of the energy coming in from outside. Just to tell you, actually, in the European Union, on a general scheme, we're importing 50% of the energy from outside the European Union at the moment. It's slightly worse for Ireland, because we don't have too many oil resources here. And gas, actually the European gas is going down because the fields are, most of them are housed, it gets more expensive. So we need to get gas and oil from other countries. This is going worse. In 10 years' time, it's 70% already. So we're more and more depending on energy delivery, gas and oil from other countries. That's not a good development. I would rather like that everybody here has a small solar energy generation on their roof, but the technology is not fully ripe yet. If you have to pay everything yourself and you can't just bring it back to the grid, there's no payback. Payback might be around 20 years, and that's not acceptable if you think from a commercial perspective. It's always interesting, and it's always helping the nature if you do so, but just from a standpoint of paying for that, it's not 100% clear.
Any more final questions? Okay, so a few little thank yous. I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight and adding to our discussion. I'd like to thank the Science Gallery, especially Beth, for allowing us to be here during Night Wave. I'd like to thank our sponsors, CPL, DSV. I'd like to thank you, Sharon, for organising the UCD contest. And of course, I'd like to thank Dominic for giving a very interesting talk, and we could all show our appreciation by a round of applause. Thank you. Something for Dominic and something for Sharon.
Thank you.